Oh, okay, cool. Did you fix it? All right. We weren't broadcasting sound. I can do my sign language and teach this way. Thank you for calling. It's the second time that I've muted myself on the recording. So, live and learn, eventually. Fool me twice, you can't get fooled again. That's right. We're going to overcome this trial of silence. Okay, so we can't say God is tempting me. God does not tempt anyone, it says. But he says those temptations are coming from within. They're coming from my own evil desires, and I'm enticed. So again, we're kind of walking through this a prayer book. And I've been drawing from that a little bit to kind of get some ideas. And I had a few thoughts from this chapter I wanted to share. James 1 and James chapter 1 speaks of the strengthening values of life's trials. He says they are to be met with joy, for they can create steadfastness that leads to mature faith. We do not need Scripture to inform us that life brings trials. We know this. We are aware of this. But we need God to give us the resources to turn them from liabilities into assets. That's kind of a weird way to say it, but I like the way that he has talked about this prayer, giving us the assets, giving us the tools that we need, giving us the training that we need to overcome, giving us those resources that we need to be successful as Christians. We need God to turn those resources from liabilities, something that puts us in danger, to assets, something that can help us. There's a difference between trials that can improve and the temptations that can destroy. Okay, I like that. I like thinking of it that way because we see this disconnect where we see God in control, God leading, God placing people in different situations, God in our lives, God in the lives of people in Scripture, and yet James says, no one should say, God is tempting me. So we have to see a distinction between trials and temptations. And the way Dr. Ash describes it here, he says that is the difference between trials that can improve us and temptations that destroy us. Okay, so that's an important distinction when we're thinking about the character of God. God cannot be tempted, for he himself tempts no one, making it clear that God would redeem us and not contradict himself by enticing us to evil. Enticing is another good word within this discussion. Cindy?
Think about Job and Jesus. God allowed those trials. Satan's the one that was tempting him
Yes.
to forsake God.
Yeah.
And so, to me, that helps me realize, God's allowing Satan to do what he does,
Right.
go off the path.
Right. God allows Satan to come into Job's life, and then Satan is the agent doing some of these things, but then at the same time, God allows me to succeed. God allows me to fail. God enables me to succeed. God allows Satan to bring on these trials before me. So trials, temptations, they can be separated, I think. Job went through trials through his loss. His temptations came through his friends that said to betray God. And so Job saw that distinction. And I appreciate you bringing that up because I didn't bring up Job in any of the resources I've got today. So yeah, Job, he went through trials that God allowed, and then his temptations came when his friends said to betray God.
I guess that shows the difference between Adam and Eve's temptation and Job's trial. They're completely different.
Yeah, Adam and Eve, they were tempted through this conversation where someone came in and questioned, did God really say this? Not a genuine question of I want to check to confirm for understanding, but a challenging question that came through Satan to Adam and Eve that said, God's not really telling you the truth here. I'm telling you the truth. There's a different reality than what you've been told. Did God say you'd really die? Let's try it. Let's see what happens. Well, they had to see what happens.
Thinking that what could have really taken Job down was blaming God.
Blaming God.
Because even with his wife, saying,
Yeah.
how long are you going to keep your integrity here? Curse God and die.
Right.
So if Job would have blamed when his children all got wiped out, all of his wealth got wiped out, and said, curse God, I can't believe God's business, then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
he would have failed.
Yeah. Blaming God is that betrayal. Yeah.
That's what Adam and Eve did.
Right. Yeah.
Brad, I know you have referenced the flip, it's not the flip side, but the other Lord's Prayer, which is in Matthew 6.
Matthew 6.
But I think its version of this same prayer doesn't stop with lead us not into temptation. It's got a comma that says, but deliver us
Yep.
from the evil one. And that, to me, reaffirms everything that's been said. The concern is that we would allow temptation to lead us to being affected by the evil one. And that's the source of all bad things.
Yeah.
Temptations, trials, etc. is going to be Satan.
Yes.
And so what we're asking for when we say, lead us not into temptation, is that we won't be drawn down that path, be attracted to be affected by Satan.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, Matthew, he includes that, and I don't have that pulled up here either. But yeah, Matthew, he's got that dichotomy between leading us into temptation. Don't lead us this way, but he takes it a step further and deliver us from the evil one. So yeah, keeping that separation there between light and dark, good and evil, between what God does for us and what God allows Satan to do to us.
Brad, makes me think it's kind of simple, but if we never let our children stumble and fall, they've never learned to walk.
Oh, that's a tough one.
But we wouldn't want them to walk out in front of a car.
Right.
Walk over a cliff.
Yeah.
And I look at it like that. God's got to allow us to grow and learn to overcome evil and get patience. But I think that as long as we trust in Him and keep trying to walk in His, He's not going to let us go over the cliff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's lots of good thoughts there. Thinking about parents and children and trying to make some space for your kids to skin their knees now and then so they learn some limitations. But as parents, we don't allow them to run out and go straight into the fire. Hey, the stove is hot, don't touch it, those sorts of things. So there's some boundaries where we allow them some space to learn, and some of us learn best by doing. Some of us learn best by making our own mistakes. So,
The fact that Jesus Christ makes us conquerors. And so we can conquer this enticement through Him. And what is such a comfort is knowing once we stay in Him, in that next world, we're not going to have this kind of challenge. We're not going to have to worry about this.
right.
We're conquered,
Yeah.
Satan.
Yeah. In the age to come, these evils won't be upon us. Yeah.
They bring us up at Abraham and Isaac. I know we were talking about kids, but when God tells, there you go.
Abraham and Isaac, Greg, go ahead.
That was a trial. I mean, up to a certain point, but God wants us to come out on top. There's things out there, there's trials out there that's going to happen.
Yep.
Nothing we can do about it, but He wants us to rise above.
Yeah. There's trials out there that are going to happen. So how do we be prepared for those trials? How do we have the right relationship with God? How do we trust in Him? And Abraham had a lot of trust in God. He had a voice from heaven. He had this message from God. Genesis chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. Well, there's your first speed bump, right? Let's keep going. Come back to that one. He said, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. And God said, "Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up, he loaded his donkey, he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out to the place where God had told him. Genesis 22, Abraham is tested by God. That's an interesting passage when you really sit there and chew on it for a little bit. One way that I've thought about this is this test. What are we trying to find out, right? With a test, it seems like you're running an experiment. You've got a theory and you want to learn something. Well, we know that God knows all. So I wonder, is it God that's learning something about Abraham, or is it Abraham learning something about God? Or is it Abraham learning something about Abraham? God tests me in these various ways that will I have the trust in him to follow through with running from and resisting a temptation? Will I follow through with that? Will I trust him enough? Because it's so much easier to go along with the crowd instead of sticking your neck out for somebody who is less fortunate than you, somebody who needs the truth preached to them, somebody who needs us to put a stop to the evils that are coming upon people. And so this test is in front of me, and then I can learn about myself. Do I just have it in my words that I trust God? Do I say that I trust God, but I don't really trust him enough to act on it? And so Abraham learned enough about himself through this test that he was able to learn, I really do trust God. This really is what it takes. And so I think there's a difference between trials, between temptations, and I think thinking of these as a test for personal growth. A test not so that I can pass the test because God's going to put my Scantron through the machine and I'm going to fail the test. It's a lot more serious than that. And it's not really a checklist. It's a test of character. It's a test of trust. So in this, Jesus is teaching us about prayer. And so sometimes we feel like we don't pray often enough. We don't pray enough. What happens if I don't pray? And so here Dr. Ash just opens with this question. And if we don't pray, are we opening ourselves up to situations in life that could overwhelm us? He says, I think so. I think that there's a chance that you're going to be overwhelmed. Even though Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, God will not allow you to be tempted beyond your strength, it is up to you to carry through with that way of escape. You've got an opportunity to run from temptation. Do you walk away from the people that are gossiping? Do you hang up the phone? Do you sign off the computer? Whatever it is, there are opportunities that sometimes we don't want to see, we don't want to take advantage of, and we feel this overwhelmingness of, I just can't resist this temptation. But God is faithful. And if we trust in him and we go down that path of deliverance that he's provided for us, we know that we can resist. But we need God's strength to help us see that and to help us trust him enough that we take that path. So that's why Jesus encourages us to pray this prayer for deliverance. Because even though God will not allow you to be tempted beyond your strength, you still have a choice within that. And you still may make the wrong choice. The decision to walk along this way of escape is not automatic. We must still decide to go through that door of escape and to walk that way. How many of us have seen the way God has shown us, known that there could be an escape, yet gone in a different direction? I can remember times that I've been there and I've made the wrong choice. And I need this prayer still. Lead me not into temptation. Deliver me from the evil one. So again, thinking about prayer, thinking about how we will need prayer in times of trial. I'll tell you what, this passage sounds very familiar, just looking around what's going on today. But Jesus is giving one of these sermons near the end of his time on earth here, and he is talking about the immediate future, and he's talking about the distant future. Some of those things are intertwined and can be confused, but I think at the same time, there's an immediate prophecy, there's an immediate need that we're going to see fulfilled within Jesus' message. I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. I think we need to stay grounded in the context of this statement, that much of what Jesus is going to say is relevant to the people that are hearing it in that very moment. They're going to see that fulfilled. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life. Now, those things haven't gone away, have they? Those things are still here. And that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. So, after Jesus was on the cross, a few years went by where the church started to grow and populate the region. And the Roman government came back to Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple. And so you have this historical fulfillment that's going on within Jesus' words, but we also have some future hope here as well. So Jesus giving them this encouragement, anticipating probably this destruction of the temple. He says, be on the watch. Now, whether or not the temple's here or whether or not he's talking to me right now, that's something I know I need to hear. Always be on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen, so that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. Pray and watch that you may escape. So I don't want to go too far with this look forward to trials and have this joy. Jesus says it's okay to look the other way and to say pray for this escape and deliverance from this suffering. We can have a balance within that. Other prayers that we see along these lines, talking about the worries of life and the things that come into our lives that can tempt us and overtake us. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6. Do not be anxious about anything. Whew, that's a tough one. You know, Jesus speaks about do not worry in his Sermon on the Mount. Paul echoes that here when he says do not be anxious about anything. I want these to be seen. I feel like these can be seen as words of comfort. Words of comfort. That he is trying to bring you comfort, a promise of peace, a hope, a deliverance, a relief. Because we are looking forward to this time when we will be with Jesus. And we know that the trials that we have now are temporary. So do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition and thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus. I love that verse because I don't understand it, and he says that's okay. The peace of God, which transcends understanding, will be yours. You can have peace in the midst of trial. It defies understanding. But I see this more as a promise, as a comfort, rather than trying to approach every word, every phrase of the New Testament as a command and saying, do not be anxious. There, you're commanded not to be anxious, so if you're anxious, you're a sinner because you're breaking the command. I don't want to read it through that lens. I want to read it through a promise of hope. Don't be anxious because the peace of God will come to you when you pray. It's a promise. Dr. Ash has these comments on it. He says, I've come to reject the position that anxiety as a sin, and instead I see worry as an affliction rather than a transgression. This is something that I have to deal with, something that I have to bear. Is it a temptation? Yeah, it can be a temptation to get swallowed up by my anxiety. It can be a temptation to let that consume me and control me, but it's something that I am afflicted with. It is something that I have to learn to deal with, that I have with me, and that I strive to overcome through my relationship with Jesus. On the pages before this, I didn't copy this over, but on the pages before this, he recalls a time when he interpreted these worry passages as in the context of sin. He talks about how someone came to me and they were worried and fearful. And he said, well, look at the Bible. Let's read what this says. And it was how much sin was on this person for how they were feeling. And now this person had even more worry because they were worried about their life, and they were also worried about how they were worrying about how much anxiety they had. So I want to be careful in how we deal with those sorts of things, because those feelings are a human tendency. Those feelings are part of who we are, and we need to learn to hone those and control those. How do we help that guide us to where we need to be? And we do that through prayer, as we just read. This even says that thinking on Jesus Christ and his prayer in Gethsemane, his prayer where he was sweating blood, is that not a description of anxiety? Is that not a description of anticipating something that would be very painful in spirit and in body and in mind, very painful of the suffering that he would go through? And we know Jesus did not sin. So we can look at his prayer, we can look at the descriptions of his person, and we can know that there could be times in my life that I may be right there and feel that same way, feel that connection to Jesus, because I am anticipating this suffering, or I am in this suffering. And so that anxiety then, that worry, is an affliction rather than a transgression. It can be expressed in different ways, he says here. What we need then is to give each other grace, give each other space. And the way that we express grief and frustration, there's right ways and wrong ways, but within the midst of in your anger do not sin, there's some ways that we can still express ourselves and still have these deep grappling with these feelings. Continuing on thinking about this as an affliction, the danger is that this can become a sinful mode of thinking. It can drain your joy from life, and that's disappointing, that's disheartening, but it's possible. And so when we're aware of those sorts of things, we have the church to rely on, we have prayer to rely on, we have each other that we can lean on and talk about the various trials in our lives that are weighing us down and how we need help bearing this burden with one another. And we know that he cares about you, but we also know, as I'm looking here through this, that God's promises are not a life free of worry, a life free of trials. God may not remove the circumstances creating worry, but he can work in those afflicted to transform them. Working within me, even though I have this issue that I have to deal with, that is part of who I am, how do I learn to control that and let God work and mold me, even though I have this in my life? So, thinking on those things, we're thinking then still about prayer. 1 Peter is written to a church that is encountering some persecution, encountering some trials. And Peter here is writing about the end of all things. He says the end of all things is near. And what does he encourage us to then do in the midst of all of this? He says to be alert and to be of sober mind. Why? So that you can pray. The importance of prayer, the value of prayer. I don't think that can be understated. Praying to God, praying through Jesus, praying with each other, asking someone to pray with you or for you or over you, I think cannot be understated, that we will need those prayers during times of trial. He says, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. And I love how all of these different ideas are sort of mixed together and mixed in. That in the midst of trial, there is grace. In the midst of suffering, there are gifts of various forms. And this beauty of this church coming together in helping one another during these times of trial, I think is something that we strive to emulate in our own lives. Something that we generally do pretty well from what I've seen. I've seen people really pull together and lean on each other, helping each other out, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing. What we don't want to do is try to bear those burdens alone and try to bear those burdens without prayer. I think prayer is the key to unlocking that peace that surpasses understanding. So. Yeah, it's easy for us to feel like some of our burdens are insignificant. And we start to compare our lives with other people's lives or other people's sufferings. And so what I'm going through, what my suffering is, and maybe it's just not that big of a deal. It's not that important. I don't want to trouble anybody with that. I don't want to bother God with that. God's got bigger things that other people are praying over. But yeah, Sue points out here, the Bible says in all things, in every circumstance, in all situations, go to God in prayer. And I think that's Satan in our ear telling us, you don't need God in this situation. You can do it alone. It's not very much of a big deal, but it is. And when you don't go to God in prayer, when you keep that inside, then those worries and anxieties, they can start to poison your mind and your heart. And you start to carry this burden without the benefits of prayer. And it can damage your relationship. So, God will give us that strength. And like I said, I think that is Satan in our ear telling us that it's not important. It's not as big as somebody else's problem, so it's not a problem. I don't think that's something that we need to hear.
We're actually, when we do that, we're assuming that we know what God thinks. That if we're assuming, we're almost making ourselves be the judge and jury of our own. In 1 Peter 5:7 tells us, cast all your anxieties. It doesn't say cast only the important ones. It says cast all.
Yeah, cast all your anxieties, not just the ones that you think are a big deal, but Tim said we're putting ourselves in God's place as judge. We're exalting ourselves. Do what? He's not big enough. Yeah, he's not big enough to handle it. Yeah.
Another important thing I think too, Brad, is
Yeah.
Stop and thank the good Lord for all the blessings He's given you.
Yeah.
That relieves a lot of anxiety and
Yeah. That's a tough one, Sue. That I appreciate you saying that too. If we were back up a few slides, it said to pray with thanksgiving in every situation. And that's a tough one to look in the midst of your trials and to find those things to be grateful for. I'll use myself as an example again. Our power was on and off. I know some folks still don't have power. But when ours went off, it was a night that was already warmer. This week, with the ice storm, we had power for the coldest night. And we could run the blower on the fireplace and burn a little propane in the furnace. And we had something to be thankful for that next night when we didn't have power overnight and it was 40 instead of 30. It was something to be grateful for. But that was hard because I'd rather just everything be back to normal. That's right. Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, 10:15, daylight savings has got me again. So we'll wrap that up for now, and we'll catch up here in a few minutes. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your comments.